It was November 10th, 2004, Bellavia's 29th birthday, and he was spending it alone, clearing an enemy bunker deep inside Fallujah. As soon as Staff Sergeant David Bellavia stepped into the room, the insurgent lunged at him, and the two men collided in a violent close-quarters brawl. They clawed, slammed, and grappled across the dusty floor until Bellavia drew his knife and ended the fight with a final strike. Still shaking, he stepped outside. The streets lay in ruins. He was the last line, holding the city from falling. Bellavia stripped off his helmet and lit a cigarette, but as the first drag touched his lips, a shadow dropped from above, and an insurgent landed in the courtyard, weapon in hand, ready to finish what the last one couldn't. This wasn't the birthday gift Bellavia had hoped for. In the pre-dawn darkness of March 20th, 2003, the earth shook across Iraq. Over 240,000 American troops, backed by thousands more from allied nations, poured across the border. Operation Iraqi Freedom had officially begun. Though the mission had been planned for months, the invasion carried no official declaration of war. The strategy was to strike fast and hard, overwhelming the Iraqi regime before it could mount a proper defense. But once American boots hit the sand, the illusion of a swift victory was shattered. Among the first to face resistance was David Bellavia, a staff sergeant from New York. He'd already served in Kosovo, but the moment he arrived in Iraq, he realized nothing could have prepared him for a battle like this. In Iraq, insurgents struck from the shadows, then vanished. They didn't finish off their targets, but rather left them wounded, knowing the screams would demoralize the rest of the platoon. Whatever tactical edge U.S. forces managed to gain evaporated immediately. Insurgents abandoned positions the moment they were spotted, constantly reshaping the battlefield. In response, American forces relied on urban strongholds like Fallujah, a city believed to be stable, even pro-American. However, as Marines and soldiers crossed its streets, they realized there was no such thing as safety for an American in Iraq. Crowds swelled with rage as protesters hurled stones at the U.S. men crossing the city borders. Riot control formations tried their best to keep things calm, but it wasn't long before gunfire erupted. The streets filled with chaos as shells began to dart back and forth. Snipers opened up from rooftops, targeting coalition convoys. Control was handed to the battle-tested 1st Marine Expeditionary Force, but even their iron grip could not soothe the city's growing fury. Commanders walked a razor's edge. Press too hard, and they'd spark a firestorm. Back off, and they'd lose the initiative entirely. And then came March 31st, 2004. A civilian convoy, operated by American contractors from Blackwater, USA, was ambushed in broad daylight. Iraqi insurgents unleashed hell. Bullets punched through the windshields, and grenades tore through the vehicles. 4 Americans lost their lives in the fiery massacre. The insurgents documented their attack in a series of photographs that spread across the globe. With the whole world watching, America could no longer ignore the call to fight back. Brigadier General Mark Kimmett, overseeing American operations in the region, stood before the press and delivered a promise to allies and adversaries alike, quote, "We will pacify that city." However, this would be easier said than done. Debates erupted behind closed doors. Some commanders urged precision airstrikes, hoping to cut off the insurgency in Fallujah with minimal risk. Others, knowing the enemy was embedded deep within civilian blocks, called for an intense ground assault. In the end, the decision was made. 2,000 American troops would encircle Fallujah, launching a street-by-street offensive. As whispers of the impending assault spread, panic gripped the city. The U.S. gave one chilling instruction to civilians: remain indoors. The offensive, Operation Vigilant Resolve, began at dawn on April 5, 2004. U.S. forces had no clear count of the enemy, only estimates. Perhaps 24 hardened insurgent groups, armed to the teeth with machine guns, mortars, and anti-aircraft weapons, ready to fight to their last breath. As the battle ignited, chaos tore through Fallujah. Hospitals were shuttered, and the wounded, civilians and combatants alike, were left to fend for themselves. Iraqi police units and the Civil Defense Corps, tasked with securing the city, turned their weapons on their American allies, defecting to the insurgency or vanishing entirely. the lower Euphrates erupted in uprisings across different cities. A coordinated backlash the coalition hadn't anticipated. The Americans answered with fury. AC-130 gunships prowled the skies, raining fire on fortified positions. When insurgents tried to flee, they found no place to hide. Marine Scout snipers, lying among shattered walls and rooftops, picked them off mid-run, denying them any chance to regroup. Just when the battle couldn't seem more grim, a blast of heavy metal music spread across the city from loudspeakers deployed by the Tactical Psychological Operations Detachment 910, seeking to unnerve the fighters and drive them into madness. Despite these efforts, the American assault began drawing sharp international condemnation. Reports of civilian casualties mounted. The scale and aggression of the offensive raised fears that the U.S. was turning a city of insurgents into a city of martyrs. Though the U.S. had seized ground, it hadn't gained control. The stiffening resistance forced commanders to reassess their strategy. On April 9, 2004, a temporary ceasefire was declared. For a moment, the guns stopped firing as humanitarian convoys crept cautiously into Fallujah's battered streets, delivering food, medicine, and a fragile sense of peace. Negotiators took to the table, but beneath the surface, both sides were preparing for the inevitable. In the lull between battles, U.S. Marines and insurgents alike turned the city into a fortress. Abandoned homes became bunkers. Mosques were rigged with firing positions. Schools turned into command centers. Fallujah was transforming into a maze of reinforced sniper nests and ambush corridors. Just 3 days later, the streets exploded once more. A unit of U.S. Marines came under sudden, withering fire from insurgents entrenched in a mosque. Caught off guard, they radioed for support. The only way to neutralize the threat was from the air. A precision strike leveled the building, igniting a global backlash, but saving lives on the ground. F-16 Fighting Falcons roared overhead, releasing 2,000-pound GPS-guided bombs onto enemy positions. The concussive blasts shattered concrete and sent plumes of fire curling into the sky. The city shook, but it did not break. Every inch gained by U.S. forces was met with a new wave of resistance. With each passing day, the number of insurgents swelled. Foreign fighters, jihadists, and hardline Ba'athist remnants poured into Fallujah, seeing it as the cradle of resistance against American occupation. By May 1st, U.S. commanders made the decision to retreat. To fill the void, a new plan emerged. The Fallujah Brigade, a hastily assembled force of local fighters led by a former Iraqi general with supposed pro-American leanings, would take over security operations. Formed with CIA backing, these men were trained by U.S. forces, handled American weapons, and even issued U.S. military uniforms. The hope was that locals would know the terrain, the language, and the enemy better than the Americans, and would perhaps succeed where U.S. troops had failed. Not long after the last American vehicles rolled out of Fallujah, the brigade found itself face-to-face with the insurgents. However, instead of crushing them, they joined them. The weapons, the uniforms, and the training all turned against the very forces that provided them. The Fallujah Brigade pledged loyalty to the rebels, and the city that had once been contested was now completely lost. As the months dragged on, the situation in Fallujah only became worse. Whatever fragile hope remained that local forces would hold back the tide of insurgents was gone. Intelligence estimates warned that up to 5,000 insurgents had infiltrated Fallujah, turning it into one of the most dangerous strongholds in Iraq. Fighters from Al-Qaeda in Iraq, the Islamic Army of Iraq, and the National Islamic Army had established their command centers within the city's walls. Among the militants believed to be hiding in the city, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. Revered by his followers as the Sheikh of the Slaughterers, al-Zarqawi was suspected of orchestrating the ambush of Blackwater contractors. His legacy stretched back to Afghanistan, where he trained waves of jihadists in urban warfare and improvised explosives, skills now being exported directly into Iraq's streets. If Fallujah was indeed his base of operations, then the city wasn't just harboring insurgents. It was training an army, wielding captured American gear, and prepared to challenge the coalition head-on. The U.S. military could no longer stand by. Despite the fierce resistance and inevitable casualties, commanders reached a consensus. Fallujah had to be retaken. In November 2004, the order was given. The operation would be known as Phantom Fury. This time, the Americans would come prepared. After weeks of aerial surveillance and drone mapping, engineers and special forces had drawn up a complete schematic of the city's streets. Iraqi interpreters were embedded within units to navigate the cultural and linguistic terrain. Precision airstrikes softened key targets. The assault force, 13,500 strong, included Marines, Army units, Navy SEALs, and elite Iraqi commandos. Before the first shot was fired, leaflets delivered a warning: leave the city. Tens of thousands of civilians fled, clutching bags, children, and whatever else they could carry. But many had no means of escape. Those who stayed behind scrawled the words "We are family" across their doors, praying that spray paint would be enough to spare them. The city was sealed shut. Every street and alley was locked down, and every bridge and exit point was watched to stop any insurgents from escaping. On the night of November 7th, the operation began. Among the infantry preparing to breach the city perimeter was Staff Sergeant David Bellavia, his rifle locked and loaded, his unit tight at his back. When the Americans entered, the lines between friend and foe blurred as the insurgents moved with stolen U.S. uniforms across dust-choked alleys and collapsed homes. Bellavia, older than many of the men in his squad, was no stranger to the psychological toll of war. But preparing younger troops to face an enemy who mirrored them was another battle entirely. As he later put it, quote, "You're telling them, keep that helmet on. The helmet's going to save your life. And then you're teaching them this is how you destabilize that helmet. And this is where you shoot on that helmet to kill the bad guy who's wearing it." And they're thinking, wait, what if the bad guy shoots that same area? There was no good answer. For many, faith became the only armor left. As the Americans began to comb the destroyed streets of Fallujah, survival demanded a sixth sense. Bellavia and his men learned to hunt not by instinct, but by learning to identify clues of the enemy's whereabouts in small details. A clean dish on a soot-covered table, a fresh glass of water in a room wrecked by artillery. And there was nothing to go after. The team had to rely on their sense of smell. Trapped for weeks behind the blockade, insurgents lacked access to basic hygiene. Their scent became a trace that could warn the Americans when they were being stalked. This was paramount, as every corner of the city could be a hiding spot. As he later put it, quote, "I didn't know what close combat was until I went to Iraq. And it's not 30 meters, it's 2 feet. The first major blow in Operation Phantom Fury was carried out by a group of Navy SEALs, U.S. Marines, and Navy units that surged forward with orders to seize control of key infrastructure: Fallujah General Hospital, Blackwater Bridge, the ING building, and a ring of surrounding villages. A battle ignited near the banks of the Euphrates River, where insurgents, desperate to repel the sudden American push, swarmed in with machine guns and RPGs. Bullets skipped off the riverbank, and shouted orders were drowned by gunfire. But the American forces didn't flinch. They returned fire with punishing precision. Within moments, over 40 insurgents lay lifeless on the ground. Their counterattack had been crushed. Yet even in victory, the cost was immediate. Amid the chaos, 2 Marines operating a bulldozer at the riverbank, trying to forge a path to the assault, lost control and plunged into the waters below. In the scramble and noise of the firefight, no one could reach them in time. The first American blood had been spilled, and the full battle hadn't even begun, as this opening strike had been only a diversion designed to confuse the defenders. Once this initial objective was reached, the second phase was unleashed. Navy engineers cut power to the entire city, plunging Fallujah into darkness. Then the full power of the American assault was released. Heavy battalions rolled in, followed by wave after wave of foot soldiers, tasked with clearing every building one by one. Overhead, the U.S. Air Force painted the skies with fire. F-15s and AC-130 gunships pummeled insurgent strongholds with precision-guided munitions, softening the path for the Marines below. Bulldozers pushed through the wreckage. Riflemen moved from house to house. By the second day of the operation, U.S. forces had reached the center of Fallujah. But the city hadn't yet surrendered. Ahead were entire blocks of homes, fortified into mini strongholds, packed with weapons, booby traps, and fanatical fighters. It was on November 10th, 2004, his 29th birthday, that Staff Sergeant David Bellavia was handed orders to clear a block of 12 buildings, each suspected of being a launch point for insurgent attacks on U.S. troops. Without hesitation, Bellavia locked and loaded his rifle before walking straight into hell. A Bradley fighting vehicle was assigned to support Staff Sergeant David Bellavia and his men as they advanced through the block. But by now, tank support had become a luxury. As Bellavia would later describe, quote, "A bomb in Fallujah was like a number at the DMV. Everybody wanted to renew their license. Everyone's getting bombs all over the city. We're waiting. I got a number, and that number is not coming up." Bellavia and his men could not wait any longer. The enemy could escape at any moment. And so, they made the call. Move forward on foot and clear the buildings the hard way. Bellavia and his squad swept through the neighborhood, weapons up, fingers steady. They breached 10 houses, but there was nothing. No contact or signs of insurgents. Doubts began to creep in, with the Americans wondering if intelligence had been wrong. Then came House 11. At first glance, it looked no different. Just another shell of a home with shattered windows and broken doors. But as the team filed down the hallway, a crack of rifle fire erupted from the stairwell. Bullets tore through the space, exploding glass and punching into concrete. Another burst came from a window. The insurgents had been waiting, perfectly positioned for a coordinated ambush. Several Americans were hit by flying shards of glass and grazing rounds. Bellavia tried to return fire, but as he raised his weapon, it did nothing. He recalled, quote, "I looked down, and I had a round that hit the magazine. Couldn't have asked for worse luck." Thinking fast, the staff sergeant reached for the weapon of a nearby M249 saw gunner, snatched it from his hands, and opened fire. He sprayed the hallway, forcing the insurgents to duck for cover. Now he could see them, entrenched in a fortified interior bunker, confident and well-armed. These weren't amateurs. But before Bellavia could neutralize them, his borrowed saw ran dry. And when he turned around, he saw that the rest of his squad had already withdrawn into the street. He was alone. Ripping himself from the line of fire, Bellavia bolted toward the compound's gate. Rounds snapped past him, ripping chunks from the walls and barely missing him. He remembers the moment vividly, quote, "I just remember feeling the rounds everywhere. And as I get to the gate of this compound, someone just grabs me by my H-harness on my IBA and lifts me around a wall." He was safe, but Bellavia knew he couldn't miss his shot. He had to go back in. Before stepping back into the house, Staff Sergeant David Bellavia called for another Bradley fighting vehicle. This time, luck was on his side. And shortly after, the armored beast rolled into position, its 25mm cannon barking a round of fire into the house. High explosive shells tore into the lower level, hammering walls in an effort to disperse the insurgents inside. With 2 saw gunners and a fellow soldier forming a tight perimeter around the compound, Bellavia moved to breach once more, this time with a 40mm rifle locked in his grip. He crossed the threshold cautiously, boots crunching over debris and putrid water. The house seemed silent, but then he heard muffled voices. Bellavia froze as he listened. The sounds were coming from a side room. The enemy was right there, and they hadn't realized he'd returned. Keeping low, he crept to the doorframe and glanced inside. An insurgent was fumbling to load a rocket-propelled grenade launcher. If that warhead was fired, it could instantly wipe out most of Bellavia's men with a single strike, and even punch through the side of the Bradley outside. Bellavia didn't wait. He surged into the room, squeezing the trigger and cutting the RPG gunner down on his own. But the enemy wasn't alone. From deeper in the room, the second insurgent swung up a machine gun and opened fire. Tracer rounds chewed the air around Bellavia, but he was faster, sidestepping, leveling his rifle, and landing a clean shot to the attacker's shoulder. The wounded insurgent howled and stumbled backward, disappearing into the kitchen. Bellavia gave chase, but when his only supporting soldier ran dry on ammunition and was forced to fall back, Bellavia ducked into a side bedroom for cover. Alone now, he keyed his radio to report. However, he could barely get a word out before he heard footsteps closing in. The static of his transmission had given his position away. Bellavia held his breath and pressed against the wall. In the doorway appeared the same insurgent he'd wounded moments earlier, now upright and armed, scanning the room for any sign of life. He hadn't seen Bellavia. Not yet. The staff sergeant raised his weapon and pulled the trigger. The round struck clean, dropping the threat instantly before he could make another move. For a brief second, Bellavia exhaled. He would later recall, quote, "There was a stop, and one single round just goes sideways in the room." Another insurgent was on the stairs, charging toward him, unleashing rounds as he advanced. Bellavia jumped behind a wall to avoid the incoming shots. From here, he could spot the slightest gap between the doorframe and the wall. It was all he needed. Bellavia fired through the gap. The bullet slammed into the insurgent, taking him out before he could get to Bellavia. Still pressed to the wall, Bellavia began edging forward, scanning his surroundings. Suddenly, a crash broke the silence once more. A fourth insurgent exploded out of a wardrobe just feet away, wild-eyed and screaming, his AK-47 barking fire. But the falling wardrobe landed with its doors open, perfectly shielding Bellavia from the barrage. The staff sergeant took his opportunity to open fire. The rounds connected, jerking the insurgent backward, but not enough to stop him. Bleeding, the man staggered out of the room and up the stairs, trailing a smear of blood behind him. Bellavia gave chase, but as he followed the trail upward, his boot slipped. His body collapsed sideways just as a shot cracked overhead, slamming into the space where his skull had been a split second before. Realizing he couldn't go in blind, Bellavia reached for a grenade. He pulled the pin and hurled it into the upper floor room. A beat of silence, then an explosion shook the walls and sucked the air from the staircase. Bellavia readied himself again. The house wasn't clear yet. Above him, Bellavia could still hear murmurs. It seemed as if the enemy was regrouping. There was no time to waste. Bellavia moved alone into the upper room, but as soon as he reached the doorway, he realized the space was packed with propane tanks and containers of explosives. One stray bullet could turn the entire building into a fireball. With no other option, Bellavia restrained from firing and instead turned the M16 into a blunt weapon and swung it hard, cracking the nearest insurgent across the face. The man lashed back with the butt of his AK-47, landing a crushing blow to Bellavia's jaw. Bellavia found himself in a primal, close-quarters fight. Elbows slammed, fists flew, boots stomped. Still, the staff sergeant wouldn't break, and when he finally found an opening, he pounced. With one last surge of strength, he pulled a knife from his belt and used it to put an end to the fight. Bellavia limped his way to the patio on the second floor, taking off his helmet and putting his rifle aside as he lit a cigarette. Just as he did, an enemy jumped from the third floor, landing right before Bellavia. Bellavia dropped his cigarette and lunged for his M16. In one smooth motion, he leveled the rifle, just as the insurgent scrambled for his own. For a second, they locked eyes, two men racing to strike. Bellavia was faster. His rifle opened fire, rounds slamming into the enemy before he had a chance to react. The insurgent flinched, stumbled, and twisted away, trying to escape. As Bellavia kept firing, the fighter's legs gave out, and he tumbled into the garden below. Bellavia could hear distant gunfire, but he'd lost sight of the man. There was no time to confirm he was down. At that precise moment, his radio crackled to life. A supportive airstrike was inbound. The American soldiers had only moments to clear the area before the bombs fell. Bellavia gave the order. He and his men pulled back, weaving through broken courtyards and shattered buildings. It was over, at least for now. Bellavia would later say, quote, "A crazy day ended, and we went on to the next crazy fight. And there was plenty of those for the rest of the time we were in Fallujah." The Second Battle of Fallujah officially came to a close on December 23, 2004. In just over 6 weeks of fighting, the city had been torn apart in what became the bloodiest urban engagement for American forces since Vietnam. Over 2,000 insurgents were neutralized, and hundreds more were captured or wounded. Yet the cost was staggering. Dozens of U.S. troops were lost, and hundreds were wounded. Still, the coalition had done what many thought impossible. Fallujah was once again under American control. For his extraordinary courage under fire, Bellavia was first awarded the Silver Star. However, in 2019, after years of review and recognition, that distinction was elevated to the Medal of Honor. The recognition was awarded at a White House ceremony, presided over by President Donald J. Trump. At the ceremony, Bellavia stood tall, not for himself, but for every man who fought beside him in the blood-soaked streets of Fallujah.